Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Leah Campbell from ALNAP. Thanks for sparing an hour or so of your, I'm sure, very busy week to talk about something that's not at all related to the C word, which is using diaries as a research methodology and the experience that ALNAP have had using this method in our decision-making research, which was published last year. It's a small group today, so I'm very keen to get your own experiences and questions and thoughts. I'll do a bit of an introduction to myself and ALNAP just because I don't know each and every one of you who's on the line and how much you know about us, and then I'll go into the presentation. So as I mentioned, my name is Leah Campbell. I'm a senior research officer at ALNAP, and I led the research that ALNAP did about decision making together with our former coworker, former head of research at ALNAP, Paul Knox-Clark. Behind the scenes, I'll just mention we have Danny and Maria, ALNAP's comms team, who are here supporting, and so they're also here online with us. And we have about 10 to 15 of you joining us today remotely. We're also going to record this webinar in case it's useful to refer back to it or for anyone who couldn't make it today. So ALNAP is a network of humanitarian organizations based in the UK. As a network, we do research ourselves, and we also support the work of our members, research and learning efforts of our members, and we also do things like facilitate peer learning, hold workshops and bring people together and that sort of thing. So our aim is to improve humanitarian response through learning. We have had a number of different research processes over our almost 25, somewhere between 20 and 25 year history. But this piece of research where we use diary studies was a new one for us. And so we had to do quite a bit of work to figure out what exactly was a diary method. And so now that we've published the research, we thought it might be useful to also share a bit about what we learned about this method in hopes that it might be useful to other researchers who might want to use a similar process. So that's what this session is all about, really. I've got a brief presentation that should only take about 10-15 minutes, and then there's lots of time for your questions, and we can talk more specifically about pieces of work that you're thinking of using and anything and everything you might want to know. Happy to share. So basically, I'm going to talk briefly about what is a diary study, some of the benefits and also the challenges of this method. When I'm going through that, I'll refer a bit to the specific experiences that we had in our own diary study, and then I'll go into detail about the sort of diary study we did, and then I'll focus at the end a bit about app-based diaries, because that's a method that we used for ours. We have obviously the piece of research that we published about decision making in humanitarian operational contexts. I'll share a link on the last slide where you can find that. And we also published this method note that talks a bit about some of the methodological decisions that we made using this method. I'm trying not to duplicate that publication, so what I'm going to share today isn't quite what you'll find in the method note, so it's something else, something different in case you're interested in taking a look. The link that I'll share also has that resource for you. So basically, diary studies are a qualitative research method. They're part of the kind of ethnographic family of research, I'd say. And there's quite a variety of different ways you can use diaries. You could, as a researcher, take a diary, jotting down findings alongside whatever other method you're using. You can also look at historical diaries to learn more about times long ago. And you can do what we did in this case, which was to solicit diary entries from participants. Diary entries can also be triggered by different things. So some of them are event-based. So every time this happens, then you write a diary entry. That's what ours was. You can have them be interval-based. So you can say, write one diary entry per day or per week for however many weeks, so it's a set interval, or you could have them be much more flexible and ad hoc, write a diary entry whenever the mood takes you. You can have them be structured, where you ask people specific questions or to follow a given structure to fill out a diary, or they can be totally unstructured and just have people free flow whatever thoughts are on their mind, or some combination of the two. So as I'll get into in a bit, our diary study was participant diary, was event-based. We had people submit diary entries when they made a decision, and they were structured. We gave them a set of questions, a mixture of open answer questions and also multiple choice questions, so that we could get data that we could compare between participants. So what are some of the benefits of diary studies? The first thing that I'll highlight is a term that we came across when doing the methodology review for this, which is ecological validity, which basically means that you're understanding a phenomenon in the context it's in. So especially when you compare this sort of method to something like a lab experiment, or giving people a set scenario where you take them out of the context where they're working. The good thing about the diary method is that whatever phenomenon people are writing about or recording in their diary entries, you're getting it within the context they're working in. So it's their own examples, their own real life experiences. And that was really valuable for us in our piece of work, and might be for you too. The second benefit that I think is really important is that diary studies are collected in real time. And so again, for the purposes of our study, we were looking at 7 different humanitarian contexts, and we, had our research time frame. And in some of those contexts, unbeknownst to us when we started the research, there was a scale up of a cholera outbreak and a new displacement in a couple of the contexts. So we were able to, in real time, capture the experiences as our decision makers were going through those and submitting their diaries. And it's also important that we were getting that information back right away. So you can have a diary study where you give people, for example, a paper diary to fill out and have them send it back in a couple of months. So it's a bit less immediate, but with ours, because they were coming in through a technology where we could see the entry the second it was submitted, we could also, it was really useful to be able to monitor what was being submitted and send reminders if we needed to, or ask for more information if something wasn't clear. So it is possible to get the information in real time. Diary entries as a method can also be longitudinal, which is something that we found really valuable. We were able to understand more about the decisions that our group of participants were making because they submitted decisions over several months. So we were repeatedly getting data inputs from the same group of participants over a period of time, and we could both kind of compare and contrast between participants, but also between entries of within one participant, which was really useful. The fourth point, which I guess in today's world was especially useful, it was useful for us and might be especially useful for research going forward for all of us in the current world, is that we were able to conduct this study largely remotely. And given how extremely involved our on-the-ground decision makers were, that's quite a feat. We did do something that was in person at the start, which could be done remotely. We did it in person, and I'll come to that at the end. But in terms of the submission of the diary entries over the research period, this was done completely remotely. And that was, really valuable because, as I say, we had research participants in 7 different contexts. And actually, by the end, we had participants in 9 or 10 different contexts because some of our decision makers changed roles and operational contexts halfway through the study and were able to continue participating. The last benefit I think is really important to highlight is around participant involvement and engagement, and even some might say co-production in the research. the depth of engagement that the 55 decision makers that we worked with to put together our research study was really quite remarkable. And we've never done something where we've had such kind of repeated contact and engagement with participants. And that was really valuable for us, but also ended up being a completely unplanned for byproduct of the study, that all our participants who kind of made it all the way through and stayed engaged with the research really found it valuable for them to have participated. It was a chance for them to engage in a lot of self-reflection that they don't normally do. And we actually have on our website a couple of blogs from two of the participants who took part in our study, in case that's of interest for anyone to take a look at from their view. So obviously, along with these benefits, there were also some challenges of running this study. Interestingly enough, these are the three challenges that we identified when we did the research for what is a diary study method before we did our own. And I have my own examples of each of these three challenges. So I can ratify these are definitely the challenges that presented themselves. The first one is around participant retention. I mean, it's kind of common sense. This sort of method does ask for quite a lot. It asks for more from someone than you might normally ask. So often in our research methods, when we engage with humanitarian practitioners, we might have them take part in an interview or fill out a questionnaire, and that's usually quite easy to get someone to do. It's one time only. It's an hour or two of their time. It's fairly low commitment. We can be flexible on the timing. We made it quite clear and laid it out to people, how much of their time we were asking for in the study. And because of that, it was hard to find people to begin with, but we did. But then even those people we recruited, it was incredibly difficult to keep them going. It required a lot of reminders from us, gentle nudges and encouragement. And obviously we did lose, not all of the participants who started the process ended up completing the amount of entries that we'd asked them for. However, we did know this going into it, and so we planned for it. We took a look at other diary studies and how many participants usually end up staying from those, and we had a goal. So we recruited about 65 people. In the end, 55 people actually took part in the diaries. About 10 people came to the briefing session and then decided at that point they weren't going to submit anymore. 55 started, and then I believe it was 33 or 34 we consider to have completed the study. So they submitted a certain number of diary entries, not all of them the full amount we'd asked for, but close to it. And so the other 20 or so dropped out at some point along the way. Primarily, the reason for dropout was lack of time. Either their circumstances changed, one of them ended up becoming a country director when they'd previously not been in that role, and so they had less time, and some of them had, misunderstood the amount of time it would take, or thought that it would be easier to fit in their day, and they just couldn't make it happen. So as long as you go into it knowing that you're going to have a high dropout rate, and you can plan for it and therefore recruit additional people, that's something that you can kind of mitigate for. The second thing, because we set up a structured diary method, we asked people the same questions in hopes that then we could, compare their responses. And I'll talk about this at the end a bit. We complemented the diary part of our study with interviews with participants for additional clarification and to get more depth and to understand some of the responses. And through those interviews, we came to understand that some of the questions were inconsistently interpreted among participants. So that's something to be wary of as well. We did test the questions at the start, but obviously only with a few participants, and the things that came up in the tests were addressed, but not all of the things that ended up being interpreted inconsistently at the end were addressed in the initial test. So all that to say, you just need to be wary, use as simple language as you can, and if possible, do even more testing at the beginning to make sure that the phrasing of the questions that you're asking are very clear. As I mentioned, we had a briefing session at the start, which was very valuable. And I think if I could go back and do it again, I'd spend even more time going through the exact wording of the questions just to make sure that everyone consistently understood what we meant there. The final thing is the time cost. The amount of time, I've talked already about the participant time, but the amount of time it took from us as researchers is far more than we'd anticipated for when we kind of were first planning this research. A lot of the time was spent reminding people and also kind of checking and monitoring entries. And so we were able to use a small amount of funds to have some research assistant support in terms of monitoring and checking things. And then I spent a lot of time developing a relationship with people and encouraging them in a friendly, supportive way to keep going, which participants gave us a lot of good feedback on, but did take quite a lot of time. So that's something to keep in mind. Although the method can save a lot in cost in terms of you can do it remotely, so it doesn't involve physical travel. It does have a cost in terms of the amount of time it can take to keep monitoring and keep encouraging people to go on. So I've talked a bit about the specifics of our study as I've gone through, but just to give you an overview of the process, this is just the method that we used for the diary part of the study. So once we decided to use a diary method within the study, the first thing we did is a bit of a literature review of what diary methods are. And I have actually a folder of resources that we found at the time. And if anyone is interested, I'm happy to send those out as a link for you to see the resources that we found and drew on to put together our method. So we did a mini literature review of diary methods themselves. Then we decided that our diary study was going to be event-based, so we were going to ask for decisions, diaries to be entered when people had made decisions, and we were going to identify a set number of questions, so we had a structured diary study. We decided to use an app, which again I'll get to at the end, for people to submit through. And we complemented the study with interviews and questionnaires, through which we were able to take statistical information from the diary entries themselves, and then also do qualitative analysis of the interviews and also the open answer questions that people submitted to the diary entries. So using an app, we went through about 10 to 15 different apps when we were looking for one we could use. The one we used is shown here. It's called CrowdLab. It's used most commonly for market research, so they had some interesting features that we didn't need that relate more to getting feedback on a particular product, but it was very useful for us for a number of reasons. The reasons we liked this app, things we looked for, is there was an opportunity for participants to submit entries offline, which was really valuable considering our participants some of them were working in northeastern Nigeria and Somalia, and even Ukraine. They didn't always have, a good internet connection. So by downloading the app onto their phones, they were able to record their diary responses, and the app would kind of hold them safely until they next got the internet, and then it would upload it for them. So that was really helpful. And the good thing about this app as well is that it allowed people to submit both open text and also audio responses for questions that we specified. So where we asked someone an open answer question, they had the option to either to type a response or to record a short piece of audio, which was very popular with some people. I'd say I didn't bring the statistics up on screen before I started this, but I think it was about 40% of the responses that we received were audio. So that was really helpful. And then we paid someone to transcribe those, which were quite short, so it didn't actually add a lot of cost there. The good thing about this app also is that it allowed us to send push notifications to people. So if we had trouble reaching them through email, or some of them actually asked us to send reminders, that's something that took a lot of time too. We ended up doing a bespoke sort of approach to reminders. Some people just said, please don't bother me. I'll submit the diaries when I can. And some people said, I'd like you to send me a reminder at 9 a.m. 3 days a week. And so we were able to use the app to send those notifications, which kind of jogged people's memories and got them to submit. One thing that we realized would have been helpful is that some people would have preferred the option to submit both via the app and also through some sort of web-based platform, because some people would prefer to type out a longer answer, which they didn't feel they could do on their phone, and they wanted to be able to type it on a keyboard. We didn't end up finding an app at the time that ticked all of the other boxes and also allowed that feature, although some of them did have that feature, but then didn't have some of the other ones that we liked, but that is something that people had wanted. The last thing just to note is around GDPR. It's really important, obviously, to find out how the app that you're using is going to end up storing and using the information that gets submitted. So we had to make sure, for example, that all of the data that got submitted was only accessible to us and would be deleted and all of that, and set up a kind of permission as part of the downloading and onboarding people into the study process. So happy to talk more about the app if you have specific questions about that. Just again, the diary process that we used. So the first thing we did once we decided we'd gone through the method and we decided to use the diaries was to identify the app we were going to use. So as I mentioned, we went through 10 to 15 and we actually ended up choosing another one, which then went out of business before we could actually contract them. And we had to start again and find a new one, but we finally found this app and then obviously had to find our participants. Before that, we researched the method and took decisions about the sort of diary study we wanted to do. Then we set up and tested the app. So with using CrowdLab, they send us a kind of format, and we had to send them back the questions using specific codes and tags so that they would know how to set it up in the actual app itself. And once that was set up, we did some testing to make sure that the language was clear and that everything was working properly. We then led mostly in person, although some remote briefing sessions where we brought anyone who's going to be a participant in the study together for about a 3-hour briefing session where we explained to them, first of all, who we were and what we were asking, just so they'd get familiar with who they were going to be submitting their information to. We talked to them about why we were doing a diary study, about how the method would work, and then we actually got them to submit their first diary entry while they were in that session with us, so that any potential questions or queries we would be there to do. As I mentioned, I did do a few of these remotely with people who, for whatever reason, couldn't join the in-person sessions. So I did those one-on-one, but via Skype with people, and that also seemed to be effective. But I do think the in-person was quite a valuable connection to make with people, although again, it's not absolutely essential if that's not physically possible, especially in days like these. So once we had people submitting diary entries, our role was then to send reminders and provide support. And then at the end, we did, as I mentioned, some interviews and also questionnaires as complementary methods to the diaries, and then moved into the analysis phase. One thing I realized I didn't put in the slides, we offered a few incentives to our diary participants, which helped to encourage them to participate. Some of them were just quite keen to be able to contribute to this important study. They saw the research as valuable and wanting to take part. But we also offered for those participants who completed the full study, so we had about 33 of those people, we offered to pay for remote coaching sessions with leadership coaches. So we engaged a leadership coaching company who provided 3 one-hour sessions to all of those 33 participants as a kind of thank you. And the content of those sessions was entirely outside of the research scope and is confidential. So we don't know anything about what those leaders used the sessions for. And that was a nice incentive that we were able to provide people as a kind of thank you for taking part in the study. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, well, that's me, and we're already at 1:30, so I will stop there and hopefully get some of your questions going. As I mentioned, the website on the screen there will have the diary study and also the method note that we showed earlier, and you also have my email there in case you want to send questions later on. So while we're waiting for your questions, I will reference as well a book that I found extremely useful. If this is something that you're interested in, as well as my folder of resources that I'm happy to share, there's a book called Diary Methods, Understanding Qualitative Research by Laurie Hires. And this is an actual whole book, the only one that I found that goes through absolutely everything regarding this sort of method, and I would highly recommend it. It was a very useful resource. So if this is something that you are really considering, then I would recommend to take a look at the book. Great. So we do have some questions. Okay, so the first question's around using use of the app and access to internet. So for all of our participants, they were humanitarian decision makers. So they were people in positions, leadership positions, country directors or program managers or someone with decision-making authority in a humanitarian organization, a mix of different organizations, including national NGOs, Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, UN, donors, etc. We didn't find any of those participants who didn't have access to a smartphone that could download apps. So for the sort of participants we were looking for, all of them had access to a phone that could download an app, and they had access to to internet rather, at least enough times to be able to submit the diary entries, once a day or once every couple of days, because their phone would store them for that long. Obviously, this isn't a method that you could use if you have people who don't have phone access or who don't have a phone that could have an app on it. So you could still definitely use a diary method, but you'd have to do something that was more either email based possibly, or pen and paper based, or text based even you could consider, but the app probably wouldn't be feasible if you didn't have phones that had the ability to download apps. Okay, the next question is around how we analyzed the content and how we kind of dealt with the concern that I mentioned around interpreting questions differently. In terms of analyzing the content, we had quite a few different approaches to this. We had some of the responses to questions were multiple choice or on a sliding scale. So for those, we actually worked with a statistician to be able to look at the quantitative aspects. For then the text-based responses, we did a number of things. For us, because the diaries were all centered around a specific decision, sometimes the text answers just helped to give us a bit of context about that decision and also helped us to talk about it with the person. So we did 2 rounds of interviews with people. The first round, we asked each participant to go into a bit more detail about 2 or 3 of the diary entries that they'd submitted. And because we had the open text entries about things like, what was this decision about, we were able to jog their memory and talk about it to help us understand some of the emerging statistical findings we had. So that's partly how we used it. We also use some of it as a kind of way to create some categorizations. So we did one sort of categorization around the sorts of information that people gathered in the decision making. So one of the kind of multiple choice questions we asked people was, did you seek information as part of this decision making process? And then we had kind of yes, no, and if they said yes, we had a lot or a little bit. And so that was a multiple choice that was built in. And then if anyone had said yes, we had an open text question for them to describe the sort of information they collected. And then we used a research assistant to go through and basically group those responses into categories where possible. We did obviously have some entries that were unintelligible. The response that someone gave, we couldn't quite figure out what it meant, but those were pretty few and far between. We generally got a sense of uh, what they were saying, and we could categorize that into some broad categories, which we were able to then use in the descriptive part of the report. For example, we were able to say that most people were seeking information from social sources. Most people described going and getting information from other people rather than consulting, prior evaluations or research reports, for example. So we used it for that. In terms of the different interpretations, in some cases, we were able to talk about them with people in the interviews. And in one case, we realized that so many people had misunderstood or interpreted one of the questions we'd asked that we just actually didn't end up using any of the data from that question at all, because we realized it had been so misunderstood that the findings around that wouldn't be meaningful at all, which actually kind of showed in the findings that what we were trying to look at with that piece of information just didn't make sense at all. So we basically just discounted and pretended like we never asked that thing, and luckily it was something that wasn't crucial. What other context do I think that diary approaches would be appropriate for? I mean, you would be amazed at the different sorts of things that we found diary studies on. I couldn't find any examples of them being used in the humanitarian or development sector prior to this, although I have since, and actually in the last couple of weeks, been sent a link to a new piece of research that I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but somebody using it for something around migration, I think. So that's great that the method is being used more in these sectors. But there are diary studies around food, what people eat, about relationships. There's an interesting one that I read about which asked couples to each keep a diary, and then kind of separately about work-life balance, and then they did a kind of group interview at the end to get different perceptions of things. So anything around how people could perceive a certain situation differently, I think is one really valuable use of a diary study. There are lots of diary studies around particular activities. So ours was around decisions. As I mentioned, there's ones around food. There was one around how teachers spend their time. So anything where you want to look at how time is being spent, or what people are doing, or how people are perceiving a particular situation or circumstance, I think is a very obvious way to use diary studies. But there are so many other ways you could use them as well. Even looking at the method that I talked about at the beginning around using researcher diaries as a way to complement other sorts of research methods on something could be really interesting. Okay, the next question is, how did we come up with the questions for the diary entries? And how similar or different were they from our research question? So the questions that we ended up coming up with were all around how do we understand how this decision is being made and what context it's being made within, which were basically two of our main research questions. We wanted to try and understand just more about what decisions were being made, how they were being made, and then we wanted to be able to look at, were certain approaches, the how, was that more effective in certain contexts? So we had to have questions about how they were making decisions and also questions about the context. And so we came up with a long list basically, and then cut it down to be something a bit more manageable once we had all of them, and then tried to wordsmith each of the questions so it was clear. And we tried to use a mixture of the multiple choice questions, which were very quick for people to answer, and also would give us the ability to use the statistical analysis. Things like how stressful was this decision? We could put on a sliding scale, for example, and then use that in the analysis. But then things like, what was this decision about? We kept that open text because we wanted not to limit people, wanted people to be able to indicate what the decision was about themselves. And that's one of the areas where, as I mentioned before, with the information, we actually categorized the responses to those questions into different categories, which we then used in the analysis. So we came up with the questions by looking at what we really needed, what information we needed to answer the research questions we had, and then tried to make them as simple and clear as possible and not have too many of them. So we had about 20 questions, but not everybody was asked all of them. So some of them were kind of two-part questions. So if you answered yes in a multiple choice, then you'd get asked the follow-up. And we also, using the app, were able to see how long it took people to submit a diary entry, and it did vary. Some people consistently, they always wrote very, very short responses, and only took about 5 minutes. And some people either wrote, or especially the folks who did the audio submissions, some of them gave 5-minute entries for one question alone, and so they ended up taking more like 25 minutes. But the average person spent 10 to 15 minutes submitting a diary, and after a week or so, we could actually reflect that back to people and tell people, to further encouragement, encourage them to submit. It's only going to take you 10 minutes. We know that because that's how long it's taking everyone, sort of thing. And that was really helpful. The next question is around the time it took to do the study. So we started looking into the method. So this was all done last year. So we started looking into the method around the spring. We then had people, sorry, by last year, I mean the year before. So in the spring of 2018, we were looking at the method, researching the best way to go about it. Then by May time, we were finding our participants and our app. We started people submitting diaries on a kind of gradual basis. So because we had the in-person sessions and we had people in 7 different countries, everyone didn't start on the same day. We started people between mid-June and early April was everyone's start date, and then the end dates ranged between October to December. Originally, we were trying to get everyone to submit 30 diaries within about 6 to 8 weeks. In the reality, most people did submit 30 entries, but it took a bit longer, more like 4 to 5 months rather than 3. So that was the data entry process, really. And then from December through February of 2019, we did the interviews. And then from February to April, we did the statistical analysis. And then from about May until July, we wrote the paper, and then it was published in November. So I guess about 1.5 years, but that was also because we had other things going on. It wasn't our only research process, and also because working with statistician, it took a lot of time kind of back and forth and that sort of thing. Okay, the next question we have from someone is around potential bias and how we dealt with that. Potential bias due to self-selection. I'm not sure if this means self-selection in terms of the participants who self-selected to be involved, or self-selection of the decisions that they submitted. I think perhaps the latter, so I'll answer on that basis, but if you meant something else, then please add in, and do keep on submitting your questions because this is the last one that we have at the moment. So we asked people to submit decision diaries when they made a decision, and we tried to ask them to do this in a random way by submitting each day the first decision they made in the morning and the first decision they made in the afternoon. So we tried to emphasize that we wanted a random selection of decisions. However, we know that people didn't quite do this. So we asked people to submit, for example, very important decisions, but also ones that they didn't see as being quite significant, just to submit whatever decision they were making at the time. People didn't quite do this, and we did have a higher than we think is usual amount of significant decisions. And in the interviews, despite being told not to do this, people then did tell us afterwards that they did, once they had a really difficult or really important decision came in, that's the decision they wanted to let us know about because they thought that would be most useful to us, even though we'd asked for all sorts of decisions. So we did. We do know that in terms of the decisions that got submitted, but we don't think that changes the results in terms of the sorts of questions that we were asking. We also were able to, in the sorts of statistical tests that were used, we were able to control for any trends that could be attributed to one individual decision maker. So the statistician used some advanced tests which would kind of limit the ability for the trends that we were seeing to be caused by because one person always ended up doing this or that. So that helped as well. So the next question we have is around, can participation in the study change the event you are studying, and how do we manage that possibility? So in our case, we tried to get people working in a variety of humanitarian contexts because we wanted a variety of decisions in terms of we wanted decisions that were very stressful and ones that weren't, and we wanted decisions that were being made in very urgent circumstances and ones that weren't, so that we could compare differences between those sorts of contexts. But we weren't, other than wanting that sort of variety, we weren't really using the study to look at the particular operational context that people were working in. So that's why it didn't matter to us, for example, when a couple of participants ended up changing roles and working for a different organization or working in a totally different context, because what we were trying to get at was their decisions wherever they were. So for the nature of question that we were asking, that wasn't a problem, but certainly depending on other research questions you might use, that could play a role in the participant retention sort of thing. If things happen, I think, for example, if we'd been doing the research study now, even things that happen in the lives of our participants, could have had an impact. I can see how, given all the upheaval that's going on at the moment, if we were trying to do the research now and then all of a sudden this has all happened, it would be hard for people, I think, to stick to submitting, at least until things get under control a bit. So definitely, things that come up, changes that happen for our participants can affect the study. For us, it didn't affect the questions we were asking, but it certainly does impact, potentially participants being able to carry on with the study. Somebody's asked around what to look out for when designing questions. I think we touched on this briefly around looking for questions that help you really get to what you're trying to answer with your research question, and also being clear and easily understood by the participants you have. So for us, we had people from working in 7 different contexts, and that was a mixture of international from all over the place and also national staff. And so we wanted questions that were easy to understand, and also easy and clear to respond to, so that we got consistent responses. And as I say, most of the questions we achieved that with, and people did answer what we were hoping they would. There were a couple of people who at the start weren't quite giving enough information, weren't fully answering the question. And because we were getting those responses in real time, we were able to go back to them and say, you know, thanks so much for sending in this diary, but you haven't really answered this question. Could you send us a bit more information by email here about this specific one, you know, while it's still in your memory? And then also from now on, can you give a bit fuller answers? And usually that did help, and we were able to kind of save that additional information as a side note from when we were looking at that decision later on. And also then they started answering a bit more fully, so that helped. Another question someone has asked around people when they're submitting decisions, specifically justifying rather than explaining their decision. So I think because of the way that we designed the questions, that helped, because if we just ask people, how did you make this decision, without asking any of the other questions that we asked, I think we would have had a big problem. Because when a lot of people did answer the how with more like the why, people would say, this is the reason I made this decision this way, rather than actually explaining how. So we had a number of multiple choice and other more specific questions to understand how. So for example, we had a question around who was involved in the decision-making process, if they made the decision entirely by themselves or if others were involved, and what that looked like. And that was a multiple choice with quite a few different responses, which we then later reduced into smaller categories. But we started with a big, long multiple choice list. Then we had questions about that kind of touched on the specific types of decision making that we'd identified in a literature review before doing the diary study, which would help us figure out which sort of decision making approach they were using. So I think the mixture of having an open text question, which was helpful to get people to tell us a bit about the decision itself, and also fill in any information we might not be specifically asking about, but also having very specific questions that asked people really what we wanted to get out of them, really helped, because certainly people did tell us all sorts of information in the open text questions that wasn't that relevant to the study, but also some of it that, you know, we hadn't asked for. So I think a mixture of the open text and also multiple choice or really specific questions that we asked really helped in terms of the sorts of things that we were getting at. And you could do similar if, you know, the diary method, I say we used it for looking at decision making, but I think it would be really interesting for looking at other sorts of activities or perceptions that people might have about certain things as well. And so you could apply that there as well. I'll remind everyone to take a look at our website, which is on the screen there. You can find the decision-making study, which is called Beyond Assumptions. There's also an annex, which goes through in a lot of detail and gives you step-by-step exactly what the method was. It shows you all the questions we asked in the diary study, as well as some more details on the things that I was mentioning in terms of how many people dropped out, how many people used the audio, and all that sort of stuff is in the method annex. Then we have a number of bite-sized materials, including the method note, but also if you're, you know, this session was meant to be a bit more about the method, but if you're interested in the diary research itself, we have created quite a few supplementary materials about the content of the decision-making study, including an interactive quiz, a policy brief talking to organizational leadership HQ sort of folks about ways they can support better decision making, a kind of flow chart document helping individual decision makers take a look at our findings and see how they might be applied to their specific decisions they might be making, and various other things. So that's all on the website. And you also have my email there. If you're thinking at any point in the future about using a diary method, I would be happy to have a quick chat, tell you more about it, send you the resources that we've compiled. It would be great to see the method used more in humanitarian development sector, so happy to help if I can. Thanks again to everyone for joining us on today, especially given all that's happening in the world. Hopefully it was nice to have an hour without thinking about the dreaded coronavirus. And again, we are going to take the recording of this session, and happy to share that if you have any colleagues you think would be useful to take a look. Thanks again for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day and week. We'll head out now as there are no further questions. Thank you all again, and have a great day. Bye.